Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 605. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about Tartars and the Golden Horde, Ivan the Terrible and Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, and the World Cup as we go down the Volga River in Russia. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. This episode of Amateur Traveler actually came about because of a recent episode of This Week in Travel, where travel writer Robert Reed asked the question, are American travel journalists less likely to talk about Russia because of some of the political things going on or for whatever reason than they should be? And out of that was a pitch for this show, which I think you'll enjoy. So let's talk about Russia. I'd like to welcome to the show Mark Baker. Mark blogs at markbakerprog.com and is also a guidebook author, his most recent guidebooks being one for Lonely Planet on Russia, one of a number of authors on that, as well as currently working on the one for Slovenia, and he's written for other guidebook publications as well. Mark is come to talk to us about Russia and specifically an area along the Volga River. Mark, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you.
And I say a region around the Volga River. Why don't you define it for us, since you know it better than I do?
Right. Well, I was asked to do this region of Russia for Lonely Planet publications last year. So I traveled there in the spring and summer of 2017. And by the Volga River, what I mean is the section of the river that goes from the city of Nizhny Novgorod, which is approximately the same latitude as Moscow, running south to the Caspian Sea at the city of Astrakhan. That distance is about 1,200 miles. So that's basically the segment of the river that we're talking about today.
Excellent. And why should somebody be interested in going to that part of Russia?
I thought long and hard about this question because I anticipated that you might ask me this. I think that the Volga River is not a destination for first-time visitors to Europe. and it's not even a destination for first-time visitors to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Those people will want to go to Moscow and St.
St. Petersburg,
Petersburg and
right.
some of the other better-known destinations in Russia. So the Volga traveler that we're aiming for is somebody who has seen Russia and wants to see more of Russia. Maybe wants to get out of the capital city and the big cities and see something of the rest of the country, but perhaps doesn't want to take the Trans-Siberian Express or something. So it's a kind of middle destination in Russia.
Well, then the Trans-Siberian Railroad takes a fair amount of time and I think a whole lot more stamina, probably just because we're talking about a 7-day trip or something like that. We can do this sort of region in how long?
It's still a pretty lengthy stretch of river. This is Russia that we're talking about.
Right.
The stretch that I did was from Nizhny Novgorod, like I said, to Astrakhan in the south. That's a distance of about 1,200 miles. By comparison, that's approximately the same distance as from Minneapolis to New Orleans on the Mississippi River. So we're talking about a large stretch of territory here. If we're talking about a trip of 7 days, I would say it's probably wise to think first about what exactly your interest is and what you want to see and do when you're there, and then choose spots along the river that you could best do whatever you wanted to do while you were there. I don't think you could do the whole stretch of the river in 7 days.
Okay. And what itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
It really depends on your interest. I was thinking about the question, why would a person want to go on the Volga? And there are a lot of different reasons. If you're a river person, you love those river cruises like the Danube, or you want to go down the Mississippi in a river cruise, it's also very possible to do the cruise on the Volga. And there are 7-day cruises that you can do very comfortably between two cities on the river.
For instance?
You could start a cruise in Nizhny Novgorod and then go over to the city of Kazan. And then from Kazan, you could go south to another city on the river called Samara. That would be a very easy cruise to do in 7 days and would give you a chance to see really 3 of the most important cities on the Volga, as well as a few side trips along the river.
And if we're doing that, are we doing that on a brand that we know? I know Viking, for instance, has river cruises in Russia. Are we doing it on something like a Russian brand?
I think for the moment we're doing something on a Russian brand.
Okay.
This is a part of Russia that would be more oriented toward real DIY travelers, people who are comfortable in working with not the typical household cruise names. But
right.
Again, this is a cruise that lots of Russians and lots of foreigners do. And most of the cruise companies, the Russian cruise companies, have decent English websites and are relatively, I wouldn't say perfectly comfortable dealing in English, but could probably do it if they had to do it.
So focusing in on that for just a little bit, if I'm doing something like that, other than the announcements being in Russian and probably the fare being more Russian in terms of the food that they're going to serve, is it, other than that, exactly what I would expect on a river cruise, or is it going to be very different because it's a Russian company and targeted at Russian tourists?
Yeah, that's a good question. But that's why we travel, right? To see some different things.
Right.
It's not going to have all of the comfort that you might expect, although many of the Russian cruise companies offer these very exclusive berths in large ships. On some level, it's going to be a very similar experience, although the entertainment will be oriented around things that Russians like to do. And of course, the language on board the ship will be Russian language and things like that. So it's not going to be that type of experience. But on the other side, the Volga is a beautiful river, and the types of daily itineraries you put in at a different city or a place along the river, you get off the boat, you take a tour around the place, you learn about the place. That kind of experience will be very similar.
Okay. Now, I'm guessing that you did most of your research for the guidebook section that you were writing on this, not on a river cruise, but doing more either traveling by car or train in between these cities.
That's correct. I think if you're not going to sign up for one of these cruises, I mean, obviously you can just buy a boat ticket to go from one place to another. You don't have to sign up for a cruise.
Okay.
But how I researched the guide was I used mostly the Russian Federal Railway system, which in this part of Russia is actually pretty reasonable and pretty reliable. The major cities along the Volga, I mentioned a few of them earlier. There's about 6 or 7 major cities along the river that have around 1 million population. So these are large cities along this river, and each one of them is pretty well connected to each other by train. And average distances between the big cities on this river would be 7, 8, 9, 10 hours, something like that.
Okay.
And the railways are pretty well organized. The departure leaves one city around 10 or 11 at night and pulls into the next city at 5, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. So you can plan your trip along night trains if you're really doing all of the planning. And then in addition to the trains, of course, there's the bus system. And between some of the destinations along the river, buses are actually preferable to trains just because of the train connections are not so good. But local people will know that there. So you're right. Most of the time I was traveling by train, and then a couple of times skipped the train and just got on the bus.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the destinations, because this is a region that, I've heard of Nizhny Novgorod, and I've heard of Volgograd, or formerly Stalingrad, but really that's of the only two cities I've even heard of really in this region. So what are we going to do and see, for instance? Let's start up in the north and work our way south.
Right. Okay. The first big city that I did for the guide, and that if you're approaching the river from north to south, would be the city of Nizhny Novgorod. Americans will probably, of a certain age, say over 45 or something like that, might remember this city by its former name, which was Gorky. And the reason we would know this is because that's the city that was closed to Westerners during Soviet times, under the Soviet Union, and it was where the famous Soviet physicist Sakharov was banished to Gorky. Now, one of the things that you can see, Sakharov was credited as being the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, and later became a peacenik. Was very concerned with the way that the Soviet government was perhaps going to use the terrible weapons that he helped to create. And this was a tremendous embarrassment to the Soviet government at the time. And so at one point or another, in the 1970s, they just shipped him off to his own apartment in Gorky and kept him out of the limelight of the international community. But today, that apartment still exists, obviously, and still is furnished in the way that where Sakharov lived, and you can learn a lot about who was really an amazing and great man with tremendous achievements. You can visit, and then there's a small museum there to talk about him. In addition, in Nizhny Novgorod, as in many of the cities along the Volga River, there's what they call the Kremlin. When we think of a Kremlin these days, we think of the one in Moscow, where Putin does all of his work and where all this bad news seems to come from. But the word Kremlin really only refers to is a fortress, basically. So, as the Tsars expanded the Russian Empire south along the Volga, they would protect the territory by building a fortress at usually a high point above the river. These became the kind of cores of cities that would develop in these regions. And these Kremlins are part of in some cases, really amazing historical buildings and histories of these cities that you can learn about. So Nizhny Novgorod has one of the most impressive Kremlins. It's on a very high point above the river, and within the Kremlin walls, which are vast, several museums and buildings, and it's just a really interesting place. So the Sakharov Museum and the Kremlin are probably the two biggest sites that you would see in Nizhny Novgorod.
Now, one thing I'm curious about is, obviously, Russia, or Soviet Union at the time, was very heavily impacted by World War II, a tremendous, tremendous loss of life and tremendous damage. But that obviously would have been in the western part of the country, and the war wouldn't have made it this far. Will we see more historic city center in some of these cities out here than we would, or were they renovated in drab Soviet architectural styles?
It's interesting because the Volga is basically as far as the Germans got in World War II. We'll talk a little bit later about Volgograd, which was Stalingrad, which you mentioned towards the beginning of this interview. That is where the Soviet Red Army actually repulsed the Germans at that point, and that was in the beginning of 1943, and that stopped the advance. But all of these cities were very, very close to the edge of the war, and including Nizhny Novgorod.
Oh, okay, did get that far.
Russia is so vast that we're actually in the European part of Russia, still in the Volga. And if you look at a
Right.
map of Russia, we're in the western corner of the country, you know. So, in terms of the cores of the cities, in terms of the drab architecture, look, Nizhny Novgorod is not the most beautiful city, that is for sure. That just goes without saying. It's an industrial city.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons why it was closed to the West, it was a place where the Soviet Union made a lot of military hardware. And so when we go a little bit further south in cities like Astrakhan, you get a little bit more of a kind of historic feel for the cities. But in Nizhny Novgorod, no, it's basically the Kremlin and some of the other things.
Okay. Do we want to move on then?
Let's go a little bit further on the river, and I think this is probably one of the jewels for people who want to make this trip. It's a city that maybe Americans have heard of or heard reference to, but probably don't know too much about, and that's Kazan. Kazan. That's the capital of the Republic of Tatarstan. That just reflects the kind of ethnic divide, this crazy quilt of ethnicities that Russia is. And when we look at Russia, think of it as being inhabited by Russians, but it's an amazingly ethnically diverse country. And Tatarstan is just one of hundreds of individual ethnicities in Russia. Of course, it's one of the larger ones and one of the more important ones. But Kazan, in addition to being an important Russian city, is also the capital of Tatarstan. It's a very important Tatar city.
And it's interesting because we will be doing this show directly after a show on, 2 shows after a show on Mongolia. And the Tartars and the Mongols were neighboring and often warring tribes way off there in the east. So they came and swept through here in, I want to say it was the same year or right around the time of the Norman invasion of England. So right around 1066 that the Tartars took over Russia.
The area that I'm talking about, Kazan, became part of the Golden Horde.
Yeah.
I would say sometime a little bit later than that, the 13th and 14th centuries.
Okay.
We're talking about Genghis Khan and the successors of Genghis Khan. Yes, you're right, though. That was a Mongolian invasion that took large chunks of what we consider to be the Volga River region. And over time, these Mongolian tribes were supplanted by Turkic tribes who set up various khanates in this area. And that's where we get the Tatars, who are a Turkish or Turkic ethnicity people with an Islamic religion. For people who are interested in ethnology, for people who are interested in how different groups can coexist, how different religions coexist. In Kazan, it also has a tremendous Kremlin, what I told you before, these hilltop fortresses. But within the Kremlin walls, you have both a mosque and an Orthodox cathedral, and they stand very close to each other there. And that reflects this precarious, or maybe not even precarious, I mean, it's actually pretty comfortable. You know, people don't think too much about the ethnic divide there that much. Of around 50% to 50% Russians and Tatars living in Kazan now.
Okay. Well, and then let's correct me here. So I was only 200 years too early, but we were talking about the 1200s, not the 1000s. But
you might be right too, Chris. There might have been some earlier invasions, but I know that the Golden Horde was established approximately 13th and 14th centuries, I believe, in this part of Russia.
The invasion started in the 1200s and then continued on. Yeah. So we're going to Kazan.
Yeah, Kazan is great. It's Russian and Tatar, like I said, so that gives you a chance to see how those two groups coexisted. It was an important part of Russian history to the south. It was the place where Tsar Ivan the Terrible, which America will have heard of, his epic victory over the Tatars in the 16th century cleared the whole river for Russian expansion southward. It's considered an epic battle in Russian history. There's a lot of information there, a lot of museums there that you can learn this history. Not looked upon as a great achievement by the Tatars, of course. They were on the losing end of this. But for the Russians, it is. And this is years ago. People don't think in those terms too much anymore. It's also a chance to learn a little bit about Tatar culture. It's a chance to sample some Tatar food, for example, and to learn about different ethnic group living within Russia.
And you say Tartar food, and I think I'm completely ignorant. We say Russian food, and I think borscht, and then I'm pretty much out. So what is Tartar food like?
Well, They've coexisted for centuries, so there's a lot of mingling and similarities in the cuisine, etc. When you're thinking Russian food, you're thinking blinis. Those are pancakes that are
Sure,
filled
yeah.
with sweet stuff or salty stuff. You're thinking caviar, smoked fish, for example, borscht you mentioned, those pelmeni, those dumplings, like steamed dumplings that are filled with meats and cheeses and things like that. Okay, that's Russian food. You can find that all along the Volga and also in Kazan. Tatar food, but Tatar food is centered around three things, I would say. The first thing I would talk about are these baked pastries that are stuffed with cheese or ground beef or ground lamb, something like that, or it could be cabbage or potatoes. These are savory pastries that you can find in any bakery or any restaurant. They're cheap and filling, they're delicious. And then we move on to the main courses that are more like built around mutton, which
Okay.
is lamb,
Mm-hmm.
and horse meat, which is considered a delicacy in Tatar cooking. There are several restaurants in Kazan where you can get, for example, a horse meat stew, which tastes, not unlike beef stew, very, very rich. You can also get a mutton dish, something like that. And then if you're drinking in a bar, having a beer, you can ask the guys to bring you around a plate of cold sliced horse meat sausages, which are surprisingly okay, particularly after you drink a couple of beers.
High praise indeed. Surprisingly okay.
Listen, I was totally skeptical, but my friends in Kazan said we have to take you to a craft beer bar. Of course, craft beer is a trend that's taking over the world, and Kazan has a lot of craft beer bars now, pretty good ones. And then the owner of the craft beer bar wanted me to enjoy the beer more, so we sliced up the horse meat sausage and brought me a big plate of that to sit down and enjoy. Horse meat, sliced very, very thin, and tastes a little bit like kielbasi maybe or something like that, but sliced very thinly.
Okay.
It was pretty good. And then I said that there's another group of foods that you could identify as specifically Tatar cooking, and that would be the sweets and desserts. Russians love sweet stuff. All over Russia, you can get cakes and pastries and ice cream. In Tatarstan and Kazan, they also eat all that stuff too, but they also have a particular Tatar type of dessert. It's called chak-chak.
Okay.
And chak-chak is pieces of dough that are baked and with honey, maybe flavored with almond or something like that. The consistency for your listeners might be like a Rice Krispie treat.
Sure. Uh-huh.
So if you can picture biting into a Rice Krispie treat, but that wouldn't be rice, it would be a dough ball or something like that, but cooked in the same type of consistency. And there's even a museum in Kazan called the Chak-Chak Museum where they take you through the whole process. And of course, at the end of it, you're served big cups of tea and where you can actually eat your chak-chak. And it's pretty good. Chak-chak plays a role at Kazan weddings, at Kazan family traditional place, things like that. It would be like the wedding cake, for example. Although it's a relatively simple dessert, it's pretty tasty and it has some significant cultural meanings as well.
Okay. Interesting. I noticed that the Kremlin in Kazan is actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site, too.
Right. It's very, very impressive. You can't help but be impressed by the size, by the grouping of buildings. Think about this historically, right? When you are pushing yourself southward into enemy territory, building these huge fortresses, you're afraid that the Mongolians are going to come back. You're afraid that the Ottoman Turks are going to come up. The Persians, who knows who's going to come and attack you. Well, you put everything behind the walls, right? You put the churches behind the walls. You put the palaces behind the walls, etc. We don't have the danger of that type of attack anymore, but you're left with these splendid, enormous buildings all grouped together. Can overwhelm you with how much stuff is in there. It's also on the top of the highest rock in town, so you have to climb way up there. You have to think to yourself, what were they thinking when they put all this stuff up here? But when you're traveling along the Volga, this is the type of stuff that you're going to see along the way. And there's also a branch of the Hermitage Museum there in Kazan, which is in the Kremlin as well.
Uh-huh. Well, and then speaking of World Heritage Sites, there are 3 that I see on the river, and we just passed by another one on our way to Kazan, which is the Assumption Cathedral and Monastery of the town island of Sviashk.
Yes, yeah, very close. Yeah, not bad. That is a day trip, actually, from Kazan.
Okay.
Like I said, you can take boats to these various places, but one of the things to do, this is only if you're visiting between June and September, because before June, Even in May, sometimes there's enough ice in the river that they won't take the boats along the river, especially with tourists in them. There's danger of hitting a piece of ice or something. But by the end of May, usually the river is ready to navigate. If you're in Kazan in June, July, or August, that's a great day trip, one of several day trips. In fact, all the cities along the river have these special day trips. This particular town was significant, but also these places are retreats for artists, a place where you can sort of still see surviving remnants of the ethnic cultures, that kind of thing. So
now, in terms of there still being ice in the river in May, what is the best time of year that you would recommend for this area?
Well, not the time that I went. I was in Kazan in April, and it was snowing. So actually, when I was in Nizhny Novgorod, one time I woke up and there was 5 inches of snow on the ground. It was just, this was in April. So I would say, if you can, time it between June and September.
Okay.
Just warmer weather. And as I said, the Volga River is navigable in the northern region. By the time you get to Volgograd and Astrakhan in the south, the ice is long gone by May. But in the upper parts, you might still find some problems in May and obviously in April.
Okay. Do we want to talk more about Kazan, or are we ready to move on?
Let's move on a little bit. From Kazan, our book recommends that you go to a smaller city called Ulyanovsk. I did this by bus from Kazan. It's about 5 hours by bus. It probably wouldn't be a major stop along the river, although the ferries do stop there and it's also on the river. But it's interesting for listeners maybe of the podcast because it was the birthplace of Lenin.
Oh, okay.
You can see some of the places where he grew up, where he went to school. The city is much older than Lenin's birth. In the 19th century, it goes back to the 16th or 17th century, and whenever the Tsars pushed down this far. And there are some historical parts of that city that you can walk around in, some buildings, some wooden buildings that have been preserved, and you can get a feel for how a Russian river town of the 18th and 19th century, how life was back then. It's a little bit like colonial Williamsburg. But Lenin was born in this town, and also Lenin's chief rival, when Lenin was pushing the Bolshevik Revolution, he was pushing it against people who thought very politically diametrically opposed from the right-wing side. His biggest rival at the time was Kerensky. He was also born in the exact same town. I said, how many historical events along the Volga have taken place that sort of define the Russian character? Well, you have these two very important 20th century historical figures who were basically born 2 streets over from each other in this relatively small Russian city on the Volga.
That's interesting. Before we started recording, we started talking about the size of Russia today, even not even the Soviet Union, which was larger. And I think you were telling me that it's 1/8 of the inhabitable landmass of the planet is Russia?
Yes, something like that, yes.
So we were saying that if we wanted to do Russia justice, 1 in every 8 episodes of Amateur Traveler should be on Russia. I'm not sure we're going to meet that standard.
Exactly. Well, think about this. In this small town, these 2 historical figures of the 20th century, really 2 or 3 blocks over from each other, their families knew each other. So it's just such a funny coincidence. And I was thinking about this question at the beginning, like, why should people go to the Volga River? Yeah. And I was thinking that there is a kind of analogy for Americans to the Mississippi River. It's not a frontier river in the sense that the Mississippi is for us, but it's part of our character as Americans, the Mississippi, Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer, that kind of thing. For Russians, the Volga is also part of the character of Russianness because of the way that the river was used as a conduit to push the Russian Empire south. Ivan the Terrible's military victories, he was going down there, the birthplace of Lenin, and then, of course, when we get down a little bit further, the epic battle of Volgograd or Stalingrad. So there's a lot of Russianness that is actually just connected with the Volga, if you follow where I'm going with that.
Yeah, well, and even before that, if we go before the Tartars, Russia wasn't necessarily ruled by Russians all of its history. We have the Tartar period, and then before that we have where the Vikings had come down from Sweden, and they again traveled via the rivers all the way down to basically to Istanbul, and first traded and then eventually conquered along the rivers as well. So the rivers have been pretty important along most of Russian history until the railroads, basically.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, how else would you get around Russia without rivers?
Yeah. Interesting. Where to next?
Okay, so we're in Ulyanovsk now. This is that small city where Lenin was born. And so let's go down to the next city on the trip. It's another city that's over 1 million people that most people have never heard of, or if they have heard of it, they don't think it's actually in Russia because of the name, and that's Samara.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've ever heard of Samara or not.
I don't think I have.
It's in the midpoint of this trip, and I think the best part of Samara is the fact that it's got a beautiful riverside embankment. You can walk for miles. It's very, very nice down there. There's a beach down there. You can actually swim in the Volga in the summertime. There's a lot of hills around Samara where you can take little day trips and go hiking. It's a very pleasant, lively city. In terms of the things to see in Samara, probably the most important site, like individual point of interest there, would be a bunker that the Soviet government built during World War II to put Stalin if the Nazis ever overran Moscow, which of course they never got there, but they got very close. They got miles away from the city of Moscow. I mean, miles, like a few miles. But Stalin never had to evacuate Moscow, at least not for an extended period of time. But if he ever did, he would have been evacuated to this bunker in Samara on the Volga. And today you can actually go down. It's quite impressive. It's several stories below the ground. And you can see where he would have commanded the war effort during World War II. That would have been very depressing.
One thing that I was noticing is one UNESCO site that we missed was right where the Kama River comes in and meets the Volga. There's also a Bulgar historical and archaeological complex. So that would be in between our last two stops, so south of Kazan and before we got to Lenin's hometown.
Yes. That's another important day trip that you would do from Kazan.
Okay. Excellent. Are we ready to keep moving then?
Samara, let's just talk a little bit more about that. It's a large city, but what I liked about Samara is that it's a Russian city. It's not a Tatar city. You won't see that horse meat stuff, and there's not that kind of ethnic character, but it's got a really lively vibe to it. I was really impressed with it. It's got some great restaurants. There's one restaurant in Samara that is made up as an old Soviet era apartment. So the whole thing, basically, how as it would look in the Soviet Union, and basically the same types of foods that they would have served back then. They're relatively simple fish stew and borscht and stroganoff and all these typical Russian things that you might associate with this period. But you actually sit in this apartment, you're like dining in the kitchen or dining in the living room or dining in the basement or whatever. And the food is delicious, and it's a great place to go when you're on your vacation. You feel like you're really visiting some different place.
What's the name of the restaurant?
It's called Staria Kvartir, I believe. Staria Kvartir. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it means old apartment, basically.
Oh, okay. All right. Excellent. Anything else we want to see in Samara?
In Samara, no. That's a one-day kind of place, but a nice city and an example of relatively normal kind of place. So if we continue south, the next important place along the river would be Volgograd, I think. And of all the places that I visited on this trip with Lonely Planet, I think Volgograd was my favorite one because I'm a history buff. When I go to Poland or wherever I'm doing a book for somebody, I really like to dig in on World War II stuff and 20th century history. And for me, Volgograd was just such an interesting place. We have to go back to 1942. In World War II, the Germans had declared war on the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. In the first year of the war, they basically overran almost the entire Western Soviet Union, getting very close to Moscow, as I said.
Mm-hmm.
So by the fall of 1942, they were closing in on Stalingrad, which is today Volgograd. And this was do or die for the Soviet Union. They realized at this point that they had to win a battle because the Germans were winning everything. And there was that myth of invincibility that the Nazis enjoyed. Historians call this one of the epic battles of human history. 1.5 million people died on both sides, including civilians. The city itself was practically burned to the ground.
Oh,
but
yeah.
in the end, the Soviet Red Army triumphed, won the war, and beat the Germans back. And victory was declared in February 1943, I believe. And then by the end of 1943, so in the next 10 months or so, the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say, because it's more than Russians that were part of the Red Army, had pushed the Germans practically out of modern-day Russia and back. So you can see where this was a very important turning point in the war.
And I would say, if you aren't familiar with the history of this, Enemy at the Gates is the book that I would recommend in terms of understanding the history of the Battle of Stalingrad. And one of the interesting things about this is, you said the Russians needed to win a battle. It didn't have to be here. They didn't have to dig in here, but it was named after Stalin. So first we have basically Stalin saying, you'll die here, basically. We're not giving up this city. And then on the other side, when the Germans start to be surrounded, the generals know that they should pull out because they can't hold the city. And Hitler says you can't give up 1 inch of ground, basically, and they lose an entire army that is captured. It's encircled in Stalingrad. And so there's almost this epic war, not just of the resources, but also of the ego of the two leaders of the two countries, that in some ways turns the course of the war for not necessarily good military reasons so much as that's just what happened. This is what you had. Basically, the Russian soldiers, as they're going in, are being sent across the river with every other guy has a gun. Don't worry if you don't have one, because there'll become some available very soon. So pretty amazing time period.
The stakes were epic in this battle, and you can just see how important this battle was, of course, to the Soviet leaders for propaganda purposes and for morale purposes, for everything, because after the war in the 1950s and 60s, they constructed this enormous statue to commemorate the battle. Mm-hmm. It's called Mother Russia in English. And 70-something meters, I want to say 72 meters tall, so that would be about 250 feet, 240 feet tall, 25-story building statue, an enormous statue. And that doesn't include, I think, the sword that she is carrying in her hand goes up another, 30 or 40 feet. It's just unfathomable. Until you actually see it in real life, you can't believe how enormous this statue is. So, of course, when I was traveling there, I wanted to see that. They have a lot of museums in town. One particular museum called the Panorama Museum there, where history in all of the economic and the military, in the social realms of how the battle was fought and how it affected life. If you're into history, if you're into that kind of thing, this is a bucket list kind of place, I would say.
Excellent. And I'm assuming there's not a whole lot left from before the war because, as you say, this city was flattened.
You made the suggestion of doing some reading on the battle before you come, and I would definitely suggest that, because there are a couple of books like the one you mentioned that are very highly detailed, street-by-street depictions of the fighting that went on, and you can see there's not a lot. They have preserved a couple of buildings there just for emotional purposes, like bullet-riddled.
Sure.
There's a mill right next to the museum on the riverfront where you can see the devastation of war on this particular building. But this city was completely bulldozed, I would say, and rebuilt into a... Are you familiar with the expression socialist realist? It's a kind of building structure that you would associate in Moscow with those big towers. It's a little bit hard to describe. It's palatial in a sense. And Volgograd is a very attractive city. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the most architecturally daring place. It's, if you like that kind of thing, but it's very impressive what they've done with these kind of buildings. One side trip that I would really recommend to people who are really into the Second World War, into this 20th century history, is about 20 miles outside of Volgograd. You can hire a tourist company. There are some local companies that will take you out there. When I was out there myself, I met some visiting Americans. So I know that there are a lot of people who do make that trip when they go to Volgograd. And that's the Rososhka Memorial Cemetery. And what's so amazing about that is that it's like a unification cemetery in the sense that Russian soldiers, German soldiers, and then some of the soldiers that fought alongside the Germans, like the Romanians and the Hungarians, the Croatians and the Italians, these were some of Germany's allies during the war, they're all buried, not together exactly, but their plots are side by side. It's like a reconciliation cemetery. So I found it to be very deeply moving that these countries were horrible, fight to the death enemies. And at some point, we've been able to move past that, at least in this small cemetery in this town. I don't know, just something really about it, and also the scale of the casualties. There's not 1 million soldiers buried there. There's only tens of thousands, but still, just looking out over those vast fields and seeing all those graves, it's a reminder of the scale and the scope of this battle.
Anything else we want to see in Volgograd before I think you've got one more stop for us.
Yeah, I got one more stop for you. I'm just trying to think. Well, Volgograd is also very good for food. It's got some nice hotels. So I would say that's a good day or a couple of days to spend down there.
In terms of food, are there particular restaurants you would recommend or different regional dishes? We're much further south now at this point.
No, I think the regional dishes I'll recommend is for the next city, actually. This is still got the kind of modern European cooking, like burger craze and craft beers and stuff like that. And then you have some pretty good Russian restaurants. And of course, you can always get pizza in Russia just about everywhere. I've got one on my path and one kind of like off the beaten path kind of place. How's that?
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Going south on the river, the next big city and the last city on our trip, the last city is Astrakhan. And Astrakhan was the southern border of the Russian Empire for a long time because it's just north of the Caspian Sea. The river pretty much ends after Astrakhan. It becomes the Volga Delta, which is another thing that you can see from Astrakhan. You can go to a travel company or tourist company and you can take a boat into the delta and see, and you can even stay overnight in hotels that are built right on the delta, right on the river.
Well, and we're now only miles from Kazakhstan, too. We're really at the border here of Russia and Kazakhstan.
Exactly. Exactly. So you asked me a little bit about cooking and different types of food and stuff. I think Astrakhan is a great place to try this. There's a couple of restaurants in Astrakhan where the menu is just one page of Kazakh dishes, one page of Azeri dishes, one page of Tatar food, one page of Russian food. So I remember I ordered what they called the Tsar's fish soup there. It was delicious fish soup. And then after that, get something that would resemble something you might eat in Turkey, like a kebab or something like that on a bed of rice. It's just fantastic. You just breathe it in. And of course, by the time you get down there, there's a little bit of warmth in the breeze, so you're not freezing. The snow is gone, at least in April. When I was there, it was in the 70s and sunny, and I really felt like I could stretch out a little bit and walk around. And of course, the river there is still very wide. And the city of Astrakhan has also built a riverside promenade, a long stretch of the riverbank that you can walk. And there's lots of cafes and bars and places to eat along the promenade. And there's a big Kremlin there. I mean, that was one of the most important outposts for a long time because that was the southernmost extension of the Russian Empire. And the Kremlin there is also on a hilltop, not quite as high as in Nizhny Novgorod, but big walls. There's a cathedral back in there. There's some palaces, museums. It's just a really nice place to hang out and to see.
Well, and just to put some scale on this, when we started in Nizhny Novgorod, we were starting, which I'm never going to be able to say, we started just a little further north of Edinburgh. And by the time we've gotten all the way down here to the mouth of the river, we're about the same latitude as Milan. And so we've covered, a reasonable amount of distance in terms of comparing it to the rest of Europe. And so obviously the weather, you can tell that the weather in Edinburgh is going to be different than the weather in Milan. And similarly in this region, we're going to see that kind of differences.
It's a total reward. But if you look on a map of Russia, you've scarcely moved the needle.
Right.
Just like, oh, is that all you've done? I mean, come on. It's pretty crazy. Okay, about my secret destination.
Okay.
I think one of the coolest things to do is not along the Volga River, actually, in this part of Russia, but it's to take a bus about 4 hours from Astrakhan or 4 hours from Volgograd. So from Volgograd, you take the bus 4 hours south. From Astrakhan, you take the bus going 4 hours to the west, approximately. And it's a place called the Kalmyk Republic, so Kalmyk, or Kalmykia. Why is this interesting? This was a place where a Mongol tribe, much later than the Mongol hordes came over, this would be about the 17th century, they migrated from northern China or Mongolia to this place on the Volga to create a homeland, but they brought with them their culture and they also brought with them their religion. And their religion was Buddhism. So if you can believe it, there's actually a Buddhist republic in Russia, in European Russia. In fact, it's the only region in Europe where Buddhism is the dominant religion. If this isn't freaky enough, I mean, you get out of the bus and you walk downtown, and all of a sudden, instead of seeing these gray Russian buildings or even seeing these Kremlins that are pretty impressive or these big Orthodox cathedrals. Instead, you see these gleaming red Buddhist pagodas.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the Kalmyk people, it's just a different culture altogether there. It's just, and the main city that I'm talking about here is called Elista.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got time, if you're in Astrakhan or if you're in Volgograd, I would recommend taking the bus. I don't believe there's any more train service to Elista, but taking the bus overland a few hours and seeing what is a really strange and interesting sight in the middle of where you would least expect it.
Interesting. Now, we talked about the cities here along this route. In terms of the river itself, any particularly beautiful stretches of the river?
The most interesting parts along the Volga, there's many beautiful stretches along the Volga. It's a long river, and it's relatively unspoiled, at least outside the cities. And when you get down to the delta, which I think is probably, for people who really love nature, that would be the place to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
You have an endangered species of fish. The sturgeon is down there. There's flamingos, rare flamingos. And they have these lotus leaves that float in the water that are enormous. People go along the delta to see the lotus leaves. The area around Samara, around the hills, where the river takes a bit of a bend there, the bends in the river are very pretty there. So that would be one thing. If you're in Samara, that would be one thing to consider, is to take a boat out along the bend and maybe hike along these hills along near Samara, which are all very pretty.
Okay. Excellent. Anything else we want to cover before we get to some of our wrap-up questions?
No, let's go to the wrap-up.
Okay. Well, we talked about the prettiest spot along the river. If we're stopping in the cities, and we said you're standing in the prettiest spot in one of the cities that you mentioned, where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I'm standing in Nizhny Novgorod on the top of the Kremlin, and I'm looking out over the Volga. It's a little bit gray in the clouds, and maybe the sun breaks out, and it's a beautiful blue, a beautiful light, kind of a gray, and you realize how enormous this river is. It's unswimmable across.
Well, we should say that this isn't the beginning of the river. The river goes much further up past where we started. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Russia or only in this part of Russia.
I fell in love with a particular kind of Russian beverage, not vodka.
Okay.
It's called kvass, Kvas. It's non-alcoholic, or if it is alcoholic, it's got very low amount of alcohol in it.
Is this the one that's made with bread?
Yeah, it's a kind of a fermented bread thing or something. I don't know the exact chemical, the composition of kvass, but I don't even think it tastes very good, but somehow it's very refreshing and it's very Russian and it's very, very cheap. And I remember every morning I was in Samara, there was a little lady who would run the kvass stand right downtown. She was so friendly. A glass of kvass is just pennies, basically, maybe 25 cents or something like that. So we got to be kind of friendly somehow. And I used to refer to her as my kvass dealer, and very, very, very nice. So I have pictures of that lady just sitting there. She's probably sitting there right now selling kvass. Who knows?
Yeah, a traditional beverage, Slavic or Baltic beverage made from rye bread, or in many Eastern European countries, especially in Ukraine and Russia, from black bread. Yeah. I've had this before. Your description was as good as I could make for it. It's either fermented non-alcoholic or low alcoholic drink, but yeah, almost like a bread-based iced tea is as close as I could get to it, but more of a yeast flavor.
Exactly. When I was drinking it, I was thinking of a non-sweet version of root beer or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably a better description. Interesting. And if you had to summarize this part of Russia in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
I probably can't use the word cold, right? Because I was there.
you certainly can use whatever words you like here.
Okay. Well, I don't want to dissuade anybody to go because I do believe that at some points during the year it actually does warm up. But when I was standing in Nizhny Novgorod, I was thinking, wow, that is cold. I would say open, because you're in the middle of a landlocked area of Russia. But when you get out on that promenade, see the riverfront promenade and look out, the river creates huge gap in the landscape, and you can just see for miles. Mm-hmm. That's the pleasure of traveling along a river, is just to see that the size and strength of that river. And then probably the last word is a little bit of a lame word, but I think it really describes this part of Russia very well, is diverse.
Okay.
Because you're visiting Russia, but you're not just visiting Russians. You're seeing lots of different ethnic groups. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because certainly the people you will be meeting are very aware of their ethnicity and their ethnic identity. And as a visitor, it's always important to keep that in mind, that not everybody is Russian.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Mark Baker. And Mark, we're going to certainly direct people to the Lonely Planet Russia book that you wrote. But if we wanted to direct them to markbakerprague.com, to your best article on this region, what are we going to send them to?
It's on my blog. It's something that I wrote. It's adapted from an article that I wrote for Lonely Planet. But it's called World Cup on the Volga, because we haven't really talked about this. But of course, the FIFA World Cup will be taking place in some of the cities that we have talked about here. Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, Volgograd, and Samara will all be host cities. So what I've done in that blog post is to synopsize a little bit about what we've discussed here and put that in the blog. You can read a little bit more in-depthly, and then also read about how the cities are adapting to host the FIFA World Cup games.
Excellent. And that is in 2018. They're hosting the FIFA World Cup. For those of you who are listening sometime far in the future, you missed it. But for those of you who are listening as this comes out, that is something you might even want to think about.
June and July. Yeah, exactly. I've written a couple of things. And then there's another piece on the blog about the Buddhist Republic that I talked about. So that's
oh,
on
yeah.
there too.
I definitely want to link to that. That I had not heard anything about that. So that's very interesting. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for coming on the Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Russia and for the Volga River.
It's all my pleasure, really. I really strongly recommend it to your listeners. It's a really fascinating place.
In news of the community, I got yet another letter about the episode we did on Merida and the Yucatan. And I should say that before I read a positive letter, I mislaid one, but I know I got at least one letter that said I couldn't even finish the episode because I was so annoyed with it because you mispronounced something, which I'm sure we did, and you failed to mention the third Yucatan state, Campeche, which we actually did mention later on the episode, and I think there was something else that we had done wrong. But some people liked it. So I heard from Don, who said, "Hello, Mr. Christensen." Really, Mr. Christensen is my father, and if you call him that, he'll say that's his father, so just Chris. I've enjoyed listening to many of your podcasts over the years. However, the latest on Merida and the Yucatan is my favorite to date. My wife and I have traveled extensively throughout Mexico, a country we love, and have visited Merida 3 times for at least 2 weeks per visit. There are so many things to love about Merida. It is truly a city of wonderful people and special cultural and historical places to visit. If possible, I suggest that anyone spend at least 1 to 2 weeks exploring the city, since there is so much to see, do, and eat. I concur with your guests in recommending the Merida English Library House Tour. The MEL Tour includes a brief history lesson into Merida and the reasons why homes were built a particular way, with specific materials. Many building materials came from Europe instead of Mexico or the U.S. We learned so much about Merida just from attending this tour. There are many musical events ongoing in the Teatro Peon Contreras, the Cultural Olimpo, and the intimate concert venues throughout the city, often for free or minimal cost, so one will never be bored for musical choices. The food, as mentioned, is consistently superb no matter what you would like to eat. Our favorite cuisine memory is when we took a cooking class with a Mayan family and learned how to cook salbutes and panuchos. These are some of our Merida highlights, but the biggest thrill for me, being a true Canadian, was going ice skating in an indoor rink at a Merida mall while it was 30 degrees Celsius outside, and then having a cold cerveza afterwards. Heaven. In closing, thank you for the episode that brings back so much about a place we love and hope to visit at least a 4th time. And more importantly, thank you for providing an excellent podcast series for many years. Regards, Don. Well, thanks so much, Don. And I appreciate that somebody liked what we did. Actually, it has been a very popular episode in the feedback that I've gotten, not universally, but it is a great destination, and I agree with you. I didn't spend nearly as much time there as you did, but still have very fond memories of Merida, Mexico. And let me try once to say the name of the place correctly with a Spanish pronunciation. It is more correctly Merida. I'm off to Florida on Monday. If you want to keep track of my travels, then sign up for the newsletter, because I do put in there where I'm going to be. I'll be in Orlando and the Keys and Miami and Montgomery, Alabama, and Denver, Colorado here over the month of May. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.